Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Brian Russo, and I am joined by my friend Nish Dubashia. Nish has written the book, The Unity of Everything, which is a reflection on an interview that he did with David Bohm, the famous quantum physicist who wrote the book Wholeness in the Implicate Order. And he had the opportunity to meet Bohm, do this interview, and then write about it. So as I'm about to head into the Sedona gathering and do the kickoff of this Holomovement, which is a social movement that is based off of the quantum physics of David Bohm and others, and how that bridges to how we create our society and our economy and our politics, as well as an emergent spirituality. This is just a wonderful opportunity to connect with Nish and hear his thoughts about that and how Bohm's work with the physical or implicate and explicate Holomovement can be applied to the social movement. So Nish, I'll turn it over to you and love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. Thank you. So my interest in the late 80s, when I first discovered Bohm and I was looking at the different spiritual traditions, was to see if these different spiritual traditions and different thoughts, thinkers have anything core in common. And I was interested in trying to identify that core. And I found some concepts in David Bohm to be very, very crucial to understanding what I thought all these different approaches to life in the universe had in common. And the three fundamental, perhaps the three most fundamental concepts that I found useful in Bohm's work were what I call wholeness, multiplicity, and fragmentation. So I'll very briefly describe what I mean by each of these. So wholeness, by wholeness, I mean what Bohm talks about, and also we find in spiritual traditions too, about there being some kind of underlying unity or wholeness or oneness behind this apparent world of separate things and events. One of the terms Bohm uses to describe this is the Holomovement. So it's hollow, in other words, it's hollow, it includes the whole, and it's movement. It's not necessarily a static thing, it's an underlying dynamic, which includes but transcends all these different separate parts that we see. Another term that Bohm uses is the implicate order. So this is an order of reality, a dimension of reality that is implicate, it's implicit in everything, but it's not explicit in the sense we can't directly perceive it in our normal perception day to day, but it's clearly there, implicate and implicit in everything. And everything that we normally experience and see is somehow enfolded in this underlying unity. So that's the first main concept that I drew upon. The second is multiplicity. By multiplicity, I simply mean this world of separate things and events in space-time, three-dimensional, four-dimensional space-time. But I use this word multiplicity very specifically to mean this separate world of things and events, apparently separated, but perceived as being not different from the underlying wholeness. When we perceive multiplicity, we're not losing sight of the fact that there is an underlying wholeness beneath these different parts. And one of the ways that can be experienced is to experience a clear interconnection and interdependency between these parts. That interdependence and interconnection is a manifestation of that underlying unity, that underlying wholeness. That interconnection and interdependency is how wholeness reveals itself in the realm of parts. So that's multiplicity. And the third main idea that I drew upon from Bohm is fragmentation. Now, by fragmentation, what I mean, what Bohm means, is that it's a perception of multiplicity, separate things, separate events, but divorced from this underlying, from the perception of the underlying wholeness. So now multiplicity, we lose sight of the interconnection, we lose sight of the interdependency. And what we see now in our perception, it's not really there ontologically, but epistemologically, it's in our perception that these things are absolutely separate, with no true interconnection and with no underlying wholeness. And that's when it becomes a problem. And most, even all of the conflicts and suffering and traumas that human beings go through individually and collectively can probably be, in their essence, described as some kind of fragmentation, some kind of perception of parts without the perception of the wholeness that underlies the parts. So I created what's come to be known as the diamond model, and I discussed this with Bohm. And these are the three main components that made up this model: wholeness or unity, multiplicity, parts that are interdependent, fragments, which are parts where we lose sight of the interdependence. So that's a basic summary of the main components of this approach.
That's exceptionally stated. And for anybody that's unfamiliar with Bohm's work, that provides that simple understanding of we need to be able to see through these lenses of wholeness. And at the same time, when we do differentiate into parts, it is with the understanding that they're whole. So is it okay, as we think of a social movement, to think in terms of these again, differentiated aspects of health or economy or governance? How can we square that with our understanding of an undivided wholeness?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So let's look at these different components one at a time. So if we start with multiplicity, that's probably the easiest place to start. We have these different areas of manifest life, manifest living together as a society, that we typically compartmentalize into these different areas: health, science, governance, education, and so on.
Siloing, right?
Pardon?
Siloing.
Mm-hmm. And differentiating these into different parts, into different compartments in this way, is not necessarily a problem, as long as we don't lose sight that these different areas are deeply interconnected and interdependent. In other words, there is this underlying wholeness, which is simply the unity of society, the unity of life as a society, that underlies these different areas. That would be the wholeness in this context. These different departments that we've mentioned would be the parts, the multiplicity. And their multiplicity only as long as we are keenly aware of their interdependence. So anything we do in one area is going to impact the others.
So we were talking about leading with the whole, giving people that lens to start off with, and then it's okay kind of considering these parts almost analogous to organs in a body where they have their function as sub-wholes. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, exactly. So the exact phrase David Bohm uses is relatively autonomous sub-wholes. So let's break that down. Effectively, what he's saying is that we have this underlying wholeness, but these parts that make up the multiplicity are sub-wholes. They're also wholes, they're just smaller wholes. They're wholes within wholes. They're autonomous, but they're relatively autonomous. So they're autonomous in that they seem to be operating differently from one another. But that autonomy is only relative. In other words, there is this underlying interdependence and interconnection that demonstrates that this autonomy is not absolute. So that it's a relatively autonomous subwholes. The problem arises when we consider these different areas of society to be absolutely separate and not deeply impacting the others. And that's when we fall into fragmentation.
Indeed.
And I think
yeah, no, continue.
We could speculate that conflicts between different political views, for example, or different views on how to run things, comes from prioritizing some of these departments, some of these subwholes over others. So we could say, some would say, well, subwhole A is what is important, not subwhole B. Yes. The opposite or opposing view could be, well, subwhole B is what is important, not subwhole A. That's a fragmentation, and that leads to this conflict between fragments. If we can see that underlying wholeness, then we will have a clear perception that what's good for A is good for B, and what's bad for A is bad for B, because they're only relatively autonomous.
Right, we can find a way to meet both of their needs. It's also really interesting in the study of natural systems for me, because when we talk about the implicate really as being a primary order, and then the explicate obviously manifests from that. But even within the explicate, of course, there are many degrees of order in complex systems. So there is a sense of hierarchy in nature where some aspects of that are not going to allow the whole system to be dragged down or brought into disharmony. So that relatively stable or structures that we could say have a higher degree of autonomy, they're able to preserve while some things may come and go. So I think we do see the way this order naturally works, but at the same time, like you've said with fragmentation, we've allowed that fragmentation to go into our political systems, the way we think about our environment, and it becomes so toxic a way to relate to them as separate parts that we wind up really creating a world that has the opposites against what anybody's intended goals would be for this world when we allow motives like greed or fear to run the show.
Yes, yes, yes. So I would say that when we say there's an implicate order and an explicate order, that's, if you like, just the basic structure. In effect, there are lots of implicate orders and lots of explicate orders shading off in either direction.
Absolutely.
In fact, we could even say that one, I use the word level tentatively, that one level of reality is implicate in relation to another level and explicate in relation to another level. So we see this play between implicate and explicate all the way down and all the way up the hierarchy.
So let's definitely go into that, because as we look at design principles for a social hollow movement, one thing that comes over and over again is the correspondence principle, also known as the macrocosmos reflecting the microcosmos and vice versa. Other ways we could say that is as above, so below. So as we look at that play between, again, implicate or dark energy, dark matter, whatever we want to call it, it doesn't really fall into the electromagnetic spectrum, but it sure is influencing the perceived reality of matter that we have. So we were speaking earlier about how, what is the metaphor perhaps to get people to understand this, but the information that's being generated in the course of human evolution here in the explicate is going back to the implicate, and that is actually feeding a greater cycle of, the whole spiral of evolution.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the key insights that came out of my conversation with Bohm is that evolution doesn't merely take place in the explicate, but whatever is happening in the explicate, whatever is in some sense developing or evolving in the explicate, is constantly being fed back into the implicate, and the implicate is then evolving along with the explicate. So the whole and the part are evolving together.
I really like the reciprocity of that. It really shows that we're not creating, gods where what we are doing is subservient beings to some higher power, that there is a sense of a co-intelligence, a sharing of the unfoldment of this process. And there's no guarantees for how it's going to go. We as humanity need to see ourselves as whole. So to continue down or continue up that spiral of really what human evolution is, do you see it as possible for humans to really, because obviously no pun intended, but the pressure is being turned up here, climate change, everything like that, are we going to require those types of extreme pressures to kind of come to these realizations of interdependence and wholeness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll say two things. First of all, just going back to your earlier point of the way we're not just subservient to a higher power. One of the ways in which this interdependency between the whole and the part can be expressed poetically in theological language is that God and humanity evolve together. God needs us just as much as we need God. That's a different kind of, God is our partner in evolution. The whole and the part are partners in evolution. We're evolving together. Second part of your question, yes, I would say that if we look at evolution historically, and if we look at, say, developmental anthropology, for example, we can, tentatively say there are these several quite discernible stages that human beings have developed and evolved through. there has usually been some kind of life condition that has acted as a developmental pressure to bring about the movement from stage A to stage B. If stage A is just working perfectly and everybody's happy, there's no obvious reason for there to be a transition to stage B, because evolution is very difficult. So there has to be some kind of almost inherent motivation in the whole system to develop this greater degree of complexity. And I think one of the ways that happens is that a particular stage is no longer working because some kind of pressure, some kind of life condition, some kind of new difficult life condition has emerged, and our current ways of being and doing are no longer adequate to deal with that life condition.
That's really well said, and it makes me think of a couple of things, but I almost want to just tie off the conversation on evolution never ends, it keeps evolving. But in your book, the unity of everything, you talk about how we could take perhaps a very base idea that we both don't really find true, that, you go from the implicate somehow, ontologically you're out in the explicate, and then you return as if it's just kind of the simple journey of, you're returning home. It's so much more of just kind of this idea of returning back, although as many mystics and myself included would say, the experience of, being one with the universe is an absolutely, perhaps the most tangible thing you'll ever experience. So there is that feeling of the ground and of oneness, but at the same time, I think what we're both saying is there's a generative feeling there, that this is really about the expansion of the evolution of consciousness and creativity, see what this universe can really do.
Well, yes, I think so, yes. And in earlier epochs, for example, if we go back 1,000-1,500 years to Neoplatonism, the belief was probably just that the whole becomes the part and it just goes back into the whole again. But as we discovered the dynamic of development, which is a relatively recent discovery, this circle now has to be seen as a spiral. We do go back again, but we go back at a higher level because speaking metaphorically, we take with us what we've learned the last time around.
So I'll just, jump in there and say that for me, I take everything on the journey because it's the unity of everything. So
Exactly.
for me, the circle will always be the eternal. It is that ground, which as far as I know, is not necessarily perhaps going to substantively change. Maybe throughout this process, it really does change. I don't know, right? That's conjecture. But there is a sense, while laws, perhaps as Planck said, are not as much laws as we think. They're tendencies within our specific universe. There is something eternal about eternity, I will say that. And whatever that is, it's a circle, which doesn't even exist down here on the material plane. It's merely an idea that we can represent. But the spiral absolutely represents the growth model of a trajectory. Again, we know that, for example, universes are probably cyclical. Not a big bang, as Jude Curvan would say, the big breath, but then we have perhaps the big crunch, or that's also in perhaps Vedic cosmology and understanding of the in-breath and out-breath of Brahma and so forth and so on. But where it ends up taking us perhaps is that even while we have these cycles and many universes keep on humming along, you still have such development of consciousness. And I would argue that the information that's generated, that quantum information, then spreads throughout the cosmos and is towards the betterment and evolution of who knows what.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up the notion of the transcendent, and I agree. Yes, we could certainly say that there is something unchanging beyond all of this, which is what the spiritual traditions refer to as the transcendent. But the interplay between the whole and the part is taking place, if you like, in the immanent. That whole play. So think of it using language from the Indian tradition. We have the gross, the subtle, and the causal. These are three, So the gross is like your explicate order, and your causal is like your implicate order. And there's a constant involution and evolution between the gross, subtle, causal, and back again. Now that's the evolving spiral. Gross, subtle, and causal evolve together. But prior to all of that, there is this unchanging. That's what the tradition suggests. There is an unchanging essence, if you like, which is the transcendent. But in the realm of change, whole and part are creating this spiral of development that theoretically could go on.
Absolutely. And, when we think of the hollow flux or the hollow movement itself, if we really get down to quantum or quantum particles, the idea is that just as on a black hole or, the Schwarzschild radius of, an atom or something, that there's a boundary condition there where it's literally, where is that place where the implicate becomes the explicate? The TV signal that I send from here that winds up as an image on your screen, when it was in the implicate, right? Where does that point enter? And I think, at least for me, the answer is almost anywhere in the order, because it's all interdependent and connected. So it's just traveling through three-dimensional or regular space.
So, I mean, I think we can say there are two types of interdependence and interconnection. There's a horizontal. So this is where everything, say, within multiplicity is all interconnected with each other.
Like quantum entanglement.
Yes, exactly. But there's also a vertical interdependence. And this is what you're hinting at here, which is that even the explicate and the implicate are also interdependent with each other vertically. And this is why we can't draw or delineate exact boundaries between where this begins and this ends.
Which is great, because there are none.
Yeah, because there are none ultimately, And if we lose sight of that and we take our models too seriously, that becomes fragmentation. But we hold our models lightly, that remains multiplicity.
Just so it's like, it's music. Some people play the violin, other people are good at sports. But to me, being able to put words to what we're coming together with and aligning with in our consciousness of not holding the models too lightly, about how, and let's take it and ground it now in the tangibles, because so I could finish that train of thought by just saying, it's not about taking it too seriously, but at the end of the day, beyond equivocation, you do need some lenses and frames to look at how to make this all better. And these are very beyond adequate, I would say. So what I want to double back on is, you were talking about how evolution drives a certain degree of perhaps struggle sometimes, so that it drives innovation and it drives systems complexity. So the physicist Mitchell J. Feigenbaum, of course, is very well known for his Feigenbaum constants, which is relative to bifurcation theory. And the idea is, and again, we're going to be very general here, as you have these different aspects of a system as they're moving, let's take our human economies and globalization, for example. When something's not working, it's creating a new bifurcation point. So the multiplicity itself is trying to take certain courses. Again, our supply chains fail, so we take another approach. We start building more stuff back again in the United States, right? So really, when we apply this type of mathematical theory, it's also ecological, it's also cosmological theory to how energy is moving in a system. It's just trying to get into a state of harmony, or at least some type of stability within all of the other moving points. So that's kind of, to me, the ultimate discussion of like how you introduce a social movement, and it itself is a bifurcation from the old paradigm, saying it doesn't work, can't use it anymore, let's use what we have and adapt it to this whole worldview, where we could actually create the trim tab to change every system, change the way we see it all, and call it a new world.
Right. And the point I'll make, in addition to what you've said, all of which I agree with, is that when this conflict or evolutionary pressure occurs that leads to this bifurcation point, it may initially manifest in just one of these areas that we've created multiplicity around. So it may start with a crisis in health or a crisis in governance, but in order to evolve in response to that challenge, all the departments have to evolve together. So a crisis in one part is, in truth, a crisis of the whole.
Absolutely. And I think, there's one of the things that I say is, how do you get people into a social movement? And it's take people where they're at. So if I'm talking to somebody that's a government official versus a lawyer or someone in the military, it's kind of like, use the metaphors, use the terms, but start in the area where they're at. And they're like, gosh, my thing affects all the other things. So how do I do my thing in a way that's going to be in harmony with the whole? And I think we also have to think of that harmony between, you have equilibrium and a non-equilibrium theories and things like that. So I'm a big fan of disruption of some systems. The fire happens in the forest, right? We need some new space sometimes for new things to grow.
Yes. So the strategy then perhaps for meeting people and dealing with a particular crisis is stage one, you meet them where they are. And then stage two, you get them to clearly see that the crisis where they are is deeply interconnected with potential or actual crises everywhere else. So speaking somewhat poetically, you start with the I, and then you get a movement in perception to the we. Start with getting people to see the crisis in the first person, and then bring about a shift in their perception to the second person. So if it's affecting me, it's affecting everybody else. That's the education.
Beautiful. And, I'm a teacher. I'm really about the education piece. And I could say the big trim tab for all of this, both on the individual level and the collective, is this embodiment of unitive consciousness. Because if I know you and I and the rest, even people that, if you had somebody that said, this is, a bunch of stuff that I don't believe in, right? Say, well, through unitive consciousness, I can find something somewhere where we are aligned. Let's start there and see what happens and see how curiosity and experimentation expands our views. So that's what I kind of call the unitive alignment protocol. Whereas in some space, maybe we're going in two different directions, but if we can find a space where we're headed in the same direction, it's this idea, Kimura talks about it, alignment beyond agreement, that we might disagree about some things, but we can both agree that healthcare governance, these things, are broken beyond repair. And we can take, someone could be an atheist or someone could believe in God, but we could then both, at least in one place, find something where we can be unitive on. And I think there's an acceptance there too, right? Of like, hey, I'm not going to find people, maybe there's not very many people at all that share exactly the same beliefs or, epistemological views that we've shared here.
I would say that the core crisis is a crisis in consciousness. If we can locate that and get people to see that, then we can start moving from, as I was saying, from I to we. But that initial understanding, that fundamental insight that the core crisis, the core wound is a wound in consciousness. And that's what needs to be addressed.
100%.
And then it spreads out from there to more complex manifestations.
100%. That's certainly the trim tab. And if you're listening to this and you're like, what is a trim tab? It's the rudder on the rudder of a ship. So I think in a lot of ways, our collective ship of humanity with this, sixth great mass extinction is headed to right off the cliff of flat Earth, right? Just to show you the crisis in meaning in actual reality. So to be able to change that little rudder and say, wait a second, there's something to this consciousness thing. Maybe if we understood it. So in that respect, I think, phenomenalism and the idea that matter is creating the consciousness, this is something I categorically deny. Again, people are going to maybe agree with that. That's all right. We can still get along and do fine things. But to me, that is definitely one of those hills to climb in getting people to understand that we have more than enough, I think, probably data across a variety of different sectors showing that it is far more likely the consciousness is intrinsic to the reality rather than merely being a product of machine-like neurons constructing a rudimentary consciousness.
Right. Yeah, matter and consciousness arise together. Where there's matter, there's some kind of consciousness. However, proto or pre-consciousness it might be. But it's arbitrary to say that consciousness just suddenly appears at this point. Beautiful. We have to see matter and consciousness as spectrums that go all the way up and all the way down, and that mirror each other all the way up and all the way down.
So beautifully articulated. I think we've done everything that and more that I wanted to discuss. So I will leave you the last word and just say, if you were just talking to Joe Schmo off the street and you're saying, hey, there's a hollow movement going on, maybe that's a bad example, but what is how would you try to share David Bohm with people very briefly and say, why is this so important to have this foundation?
Well, I think what I'd say is that, do you realize, or can you see that everything that you are doing or that I am doing is in some way affecting everything and everybody else? That's the starting point. Get people to see that they're not living in the isolation that they think they are.
And that's
Everything you do is somehow affecting everybody. I mean, get people to watch a good movie on the butterfly effect. You
good.
do a tiny little thing here, it's going to, the impact of that is going to spread, and you have no idea what your tiny actions and tiny thinking and tiny speech may have on the whole. And I think if we can truly get that, then we become responsible for everything we do, think, and say, because we are the whole. We are instantations of the whole, instances of the whole. Yeah.
Wow, there's so much to unpack there that's so beautiful, but I'll leave that as is and just make one comment and maybe give you one more word on this. But David R. Hawkins, he talks of in power versus force, this idea that, look, this is also, we are vibratory beings, electric beings within this order. And depending, I've had a biophoton scan of my body to say how many biophotons, how much light do I actually have in me, right? And we know that when we don't do things on a physical level, drinking too much alcohol or whatever it might be, that lowers your biophoton count, that makes your tissue more diseased and less healthy, less oxygenated, you become holding less light. So David Hawkins is basically saying the more light you hold, imagine how much lower vibration, and this is without any, quote, new age speak, because that's just another diversionary a way to look at all this. But seriously, if we do adapt this idea of, a light quotient, or talking more in terms of the vibratory capacity of a human being, that when we do hold this light, he was saying that that cancels out so much of the, quote, lower vibration that might be held through people and systems. And the light is so much more exponentially powerful than, the lack of it, that it has so much of a power to do good. So people don't realize that in a single action, the power they have to do such good.
Absolutely. There's a saying in Christian theology, which is that darkness isn't a thing in its own right. Darkness is just the absence of light.
Yeah, it's a lack of reflection of the good in some sense. So nothing's ever truly dark. And your words were just so apropos, because we live in this post-pandemic society that is saying, get isolated, stay 6 feet away from people. And, there's something to be said about quarantining from pandemics. I'm not going to deny that. But the idea that we've become more isolated on every level, maybe again, here we are through the miracles of tech talking to each other. I love that, but just in a lot of ways, so overly dependent on that, is we maybe feel as a bunch of people more isolated, separated, and perhaps disempowered than ever. And your message seems to be one of wholeness, lending itself to empowerment based off of the small effects we have making a big difference.
Absolutely. And wholeness is not something we need to create. Wholeness is already our true nature from the very beginning. We just need to remove what's blocking that out, not generate something that isn't already there. So it's a cleanup job. It's not a build something new job.
You do have me at one more story. It's going to be hard to end this, but I'll say this. The king, the emperor says to, China, says, you need to come here and create this best room ever. And he says to the Greeks, come here, same thing, create the best room ever. He opens it up. The Chinese, they've brought in their best sculptures. They have brought in, beautiful vases and gold, and it's just unbelievable human creative art. He goes and opens the Greek room. Nothing. They have just spent the entire time cleaning the room, so it's just reflecting the light in the space, and it's all perfect. It's all whole, baby.
Yes, yes.
Awesome, Nish. Well, much love to you, brother. I appreciate this so much. I'm going to end the recording, and just such a blessing. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and stay whole.